How do you make a two-point perspective drawing without vanishing points? It's an interesting question. But before getting to that, let's take a look at some perspective examples. And then we're going to ask ourselves, why would one want to make a two-point perspective drawing without using vanishing points? And then we'll get to how. Let's start off with a box shape. And holding a box like this is a perfect setup for one-point perspective, because there's one family of edges that are horizontal and will be drawn as such. There's another family of edges that are vertical and would also be drawn vertically. But there's a last set of edges that are receding away from the viewer. And if the viewer had X-ray vision and could see through the box into infinity, and if those edges were extended towards infinity, they would appear to converge at a common vanishing point. Now let's imagine that this box is on a turntable, and I rotate the turntable like this. So the edges that previously were pointing to one vanishing point in the shape of the box are now still pointing to a vanishing point. If they are extended, they're still going to converge ultimately at a vanishing point. But this vanishing point now is pushed off to the right. And as I rotated the box, the family of lines that were once horizontal are now directing themselves towards their own vanishing point off to the left. So that's a perfect setup for two-point perspective. Below that is another example of two-point perspective, except I've taken a couple of box shapes and stacked them on each other so you can see the potential for drawing architecture with box shapes. You just keep adding box shapes and you can build up any architecture that you would like. The second example shows what happens when you put vanishing points too close to each other, squeezing up against the subject matter. That's a problem because you're going to get a very distorted representation of architecture or whatever your subject matter is. It's going to look distorted because those vanishing points are very close to each other. So we've looked at the difference between one-point and two-point perspective. We have a general understanding of the logic of not pushing those vanishing points too close to each other when we want to represent any kind of geometric subject matter or architecture. And so we come to this example here. This is set up in order to be able to draw an architectural subject in two-point perspective. And I want to focus my attention in this area where I'd like to draw the building blocks for what could become a building, a piece of architecture. And I understand that these vanishing points are very far away from each other. And yet, if I'm working in my sketchbook, I'd like to fill my page with my architectural subject matter. I don't want to have to shrink my subject so small that the vanishing points end up in my composition so that I could construct this representation of architecture with vanishing points. So because I want to blow up my subject matter and work at a healthy size relative to my composition, my vanishing points go off the edges of my paper and it becomes inconvenient, because if I'm working in my sketchbook, I'd have to visualize where those vanishing points are. I could add scrap paper to the right and to the left and draw those vanishing points and temporarily draw lines back into my composition, but that's not particularly convenient. So now we understand why we want to draw a two-point perspective drawing without the use of vanishing points, because they're quite simply a drag if you want to draw big in your page. So let's take a look at how we could approach this. The first thing that we could think about would be taking a look at this box shape. It requires us to imagine that we have a ruler that we could position along one edge of the box shape and then slide along one of the planes of the box to another location of that box. So we could position a ruler here in the front corner, slide it this way. We could also position it here and slide it that way. We could also keep going if we want to add more architectural elements. So let's think about that imaginary ruler when doing this drawing. So I would like to stack a number of boxes on each other. Let's do this with 4 boxes. So this would be the top part of my architectural drawing, and that would be the bottom. So let's divide these 2 points into 2, visually guesstimating that location, and divide each of those halves into 2. So this becomes my ruler that measures the closest edge of this architectural subject matter. And if I imagine sliding that ruler along one plane of that architecture, moving away into space, it would eventually hit the edge of my composition. And I could imagine that ruler at the edge of my composition, top and bottom, and now I'm going to divide this into 4 units, just like I divided its cousin ruler, if you will, located at the closest edge of the architecture. So I'm going to divide it into 4. Again, visually guesstimating this. And perhaps you'll see where I'm headed with this. Since this ruler is essentially the same as that ruler except slid further away in space, if I connect the various increments of this ruler with the various increments of that ruler, I can actually create a perspective grid without ever having to draw all the way back to the vanishing point. So let's take a look. Here, let's do a little bit of a better job on that. I want to make it nice and straight. So now I'm connecting these increments, each increment of the further away ruler, which with its cousin increment, if you will, on the closest ruler. And voila, I've created the beginning of a perspective grid. Now, just because my building is limited to this height, it doesn't mean that I can't draw more elements of that grid above and below. All I have to do is add another one of those units above, which in this case goes slightly out of the composition on this portion of the drawing. And I can add another one of these units above itself and make a dot and connect those and stop because I'm at the edge of my composition, but voila, I have another element in my perspective grid. So I can do this same procedure again, except moving off to the right to the other vanishing point. So I have my ruler that I began with, and if I imagine sliding it down until it's quite a fair distance further away from us, it's quite small, where it hits the right border of my composition, I'm going to divide that into 2 and then into 2 again. And each of these increments I can now connect up and again, without having drawn the lines all the way to the vanishing points, I've created a perspective grid. And I could continue that on by adding more units above and below to my heart's desire. And I could continue adding elements to that grid. It's quite a lovely thing because it now permits the artist to not have to rely on vanishing points in order to draw a grid. And from this grid, you can then construct architectural subject matters. So this is just fantastic in terms of convenience and not having to always rely on vanishing points. It takes a little bit of practice because unless you want to work with very complex grids, you have to sometimes guesstimate what a line would be angled at. But that's part of the joy of freehand drawing. So the way that you would start this out is in looking at your architectural subject matter. The first thing that you would do would be to gauge two lines, each going to their respective vanishing point, as best you can. Now you can use sighting as a technique. Sighting relies on you looking at a particular angle of line and holding your, whatever it is that you're working with, whether it's pencil or pen, holding your pencil or pen in line with that particular edge, and then bringing that over to where you're drawing and understanding what that edge would be angled at. So I'm going to do that here. So I understand that one of my edges is going to be angled like that, and I'm going to gauge the angle of the edge on the other plane, and I'll do my best to replicate that angle. So this technique is wonderful for starting off with just two angles of line, each in their respective planes, pointing to their respective vanishing points. You don't see where the vanishing points are, but from the point of departure of a horizontal line and two well-judged angles of edges, the rest you can generate with this technique that I showed you in the small example. So let's take a look. I'm going to improvise some architecture here and see what I come up with. Well, that looks fairly convincing, except perhaps for the pterodactyl.